Hello. Thanks for looking at my talk. My name is Richard Stevens, and I will tell you about our project on thermal convection, which we are currently performing at the SuperMUC NG Supercomputing Center. First of all, I would like to thank my collaborators, who are listed here on the slides, for all their great work on this project. And the work that is presented in this presentation has been published in various journal publications, but in this presentation I will just give a short overview of the work that we're doing in this project. Thermal convection you see all around us. So, for example, thermal convection in the atmosphere, in the oceans, in stars, or in industrial applications. So, many of these thermal convection problems are complicated because they are obtained in very large aspect ratio systems. They may be affected by rotation, and they are happening in very, very turbulent flows. And this makes simulation of these problems very computationally intensive and difficult. In this project, we're looking at the fundamental properties of thermal convection, and therefore we're looking at Rayleigh-Benard convection, which is a system heated from below and cooled from above, such that a large-scale convection wall is formed in the system of hot, warm fluid going up on one side of the cell, and cold, heavier fluid going down on the other side of the cell. The system is described by a few control parameters. The aspect ratio of the system, which is the width over the height of the system. The Rayleigh number, which is indicating the non-dimensional thermal driving of the system, which is basically a measure for the non-dimensional temperature difference between the plates. And the Prandtl number, which is indicating the properties of the fluid. We're solving this flow using the AFIT code, which is open source, available on the link here at the top of the slide. And in this code we are solving the Navier-Stokes equations within the Boussinesq approximation with the additional temperature equation. So we're solving this on a periodic mesh in the horizontal directions using an equidistant mesh in that direction. And the grid is stretched in the vertical direction to ensure that the boundary layers close to the plates are fully resolved. The most time-consuming part of the code is the Poisson Solver, as this requires all-to-all communication in order to solve this Poisson equation over the three-dimensional domain. And this is required by solving the Fourier transformations and tridiagonal solvers that are obtained in these different pencil configurations indicated here on the slide. And then we have to go back and forth between these different pencil configurations in order to do all the required operations. And this is based on the pencil decomposition used in the 2decomp library, but adjusted to the specifics of the simulation scheme used over here. This code has been developed in collaboration with the Max Planck Center in Twente, the University of Twente, or the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, and several supercomputing experts that serve Sarah, Gauss Computing Center, and we also made a version available for GPUs together with NVIDIA. So the code is open source, available as indicated before, and is written in Fortran 90, and parallelization is obtained using MPI and OpenMP. The I/O operations are performed using parallel HDF5. So the slide over here indicates the scaling performance I obtained on the SuperMUC NG system. So on the vertical axis it's showing the speed up, on the horizontal axis the number of cores that is used, 4 different problem sizes considered. And then we see that the scalability of the code improves when we consider larger system sizes. And for the very large system sizes, good performance is obtained up to 10 to the 5 cores and above. Most of the typical simulations in the project are performed for 32,000 cores, so roughly 1 computational island on the SuperMUC NG system. And simulations with up to 100 billion computational nodes are considered for very long integration times, such that the largest simulations require up to 50 million CPU hours. And the largest flow fields are of the order of 4.2 terabytes, and these flow fields are used for flow analysis as well as restarting of the simulations. So the large-scale structures that are formed is one of the things that we're interested in. So like we see in the visualization over here, again, this large-scale circulation that is formed in the system. So the blue region of cold fluid going down, and the warm red regions of warm fluid going up. And then like we want to know how these flow structures depend on the system size. Given that this is like a periodic system, ideally the flow structure should not depend on the system size that is used. So like first we're looking here at the heat transfer as function of the aspect ratio of the system. And we see that the system has to be quite large before the heat transfer becomes independent of the system size. It's important here to note that the typical size of experiments and simulations is in this gray region, so like much smaller than the size that is needed in order to obtain this regime in which the flow dynamics becomes independent of the system size. And the reason for this is this large-scale flow organization that I'm talking about. So we see here a visualization of the flow in the next slide for aspect ratio 8. If you're looking here at mid-height, we see that there's like one large-scale convection roll in the system. So there's like one red region that is connected to itself, and like one blue region that is connected to itself. So there's like just one large-scale circulation in this system, since like this domain is periodic, so the red and the blue are essentially connected to each other. And like only if you do it in a very, very large system of here aspect ratio 64, you see that multiple convection rolls are formed in the system, which are then getting like a random orientation and shape, indicating that like the convection pattern is like what it would naturally want to be. Here the very small black squares indicating the typical size used in an experiment, so you can see that that is tiny compared to what we are considering in these simulations. So like one of the crucial and very exciting findings in this work is that like if we look at the size of these turbulent superstructures versus the Rayleigh number, so that's the thermal driving of the system, that like the more turbulent the flow becomes, like the larger these flow structures becomes. Like this is very unexpected, given that like a more turbulent flow organization would indicate that there's more fluctuations in the flow, but nevertheless we actually get like larger and larger flow structures in the domain. Another exciting finding is that like you would expect that the temperature and the vertical velocity would be very similar, since like the flow is buoyancy driven, so like warm fluid goes up and cold fluid goes down. However, when we look at the temperature and the vertical velocity field, we see that they're very different if we're looking at like the horizontal midplane. And specifically we see like much smaller flow structures in the vertical velocity field than in the temperature field. So this surprisingly, these two are not the same. And like we can actually find that if you're doing a filtering operation on both the temperature and the vertical velocity field such that we are like removing the smaller scale structures from the flow, that they will agree like perfectly. So like if we do like a spectral filtering in which we remove the smaller scale structures, and then we look at the temperature and the vertical velocity field again, in that case we see that there's like a perfect agreement between these two. And this we can analyze in some more detail. So if we're looking at like the coherence, so how similar are the temperature and the vertical velocity fields for different wave numbers. So like small wave numbers are indicating large scale structures, high wave numbers indicating small scale structures. We find a very large coherence for the larger scale structures, but a much smaller coherence for the smaller scale structures. And this is obtained for like different heights. One exception is that we see that there is like a reasonably high coherence in the small scale structures when we're looking very close to the plate. And these are like the thermal plumes that are formed in that region of like warm fluid that is like rising up close to the plate, and then subsequently are organized together in these large scale convection rolls in the middle of the domain. And this like brings us to the vertical coherence of the flow, where we see that there's like a large vertical coherence in the large scales, but the small scales are not really the same in different heights of the system. So to give you some impression of like what this actually means, we're looking here at the temperature field at mid-height, and we see that there's like large red regions of upwelling flow and like cold regions of flow going down. And then we see that this large-scale flow organization is having an imprint on what is happening close to the plate. So we see that the lighter and darker regions in the temperature field close to the plate match what's happening at mid-height. But there, in addition, you see these thermal plumes that are like formed of like locally uprising fluids that is giving this larger coherence for the smaller scale structures. And like it's actually this boundary layer dynamics that is like very crucial for the heat transfer in the system. So this is something that is like of special interest to the community. And this becomes particularly important if you're looking at like even higher Rayleigh number flows. So what's interesting is like the heat transfer as function of this this temperature difference indicated by the Rayleigh number, and then like the flow dynamics is like well understood in this classical regime in which these boundary layers are still behaving in a laminar way. But then when the boundary layers become turbulent, this will trigger an ultimate regime of thermal convection, in which the heat transfer will increase much faster than like in this classical regime in which the boundary layers are like still turbulent or like still laminar. And this is particularly challenging to do in simulations, but also in experiments. So like here, there's a slide showing the progress of simulations as function of time. So we see that like we need to do like increasingly larger simulations in order to reach these higher Rayleigh number cases. And we see that the simulations are keeping up with Moore's law over the last 2 to 3 decades. And like what we're doing in these simulations is like the simulation in cylinders. Like we're like, this will allow like a one-to-one comparison to, this will allow one-to-one comparison between like experiments and simulations. Experiments being performed in Göttingen and the simulations performed in the Max Planck Center in Twente. And like now we're doing simulations up to like really 10 to the 13 in this system. So like experiments are also very challenging since like, they need to be performed in a fully thermally isolated system, and this makes it very difficult to see details of the flow, as you can imagine looking at the picture over here of like someone working on this system. And then the system has to be placed in like a high pressurized environment in order to make sure that the Rayleigh number that can be reached is like high enough to reach this ultimate regime. What we then see in the measurements over here is the heat transfer as function of the Rayleigh number on the horizontal axis. And then we see that like towards the highest Rayleigh numbers that can be reached in these experiments, that this ultimate regime is triggered very nicely, showing this much faster increase in heat transfer with the heat transfer exponent as predicted by theoretical arguments. And then like the goal of this project is to then like use simulations to do like a one-to-one comparison between the experiments and the simulations. The simulations having the benefit that like all the flow structures can be analyzed in detail, whereas like this is not possible in the experiments. And like this is like actually a challenging problem for the field. So like here we see the heat transfer enhancements as function of the Rayleigh number, showing different experimental measurements, showing that there's like a reasonably large spread in the different measurements that are performed, reaching this ultimate regime here in the Göttingen experiments as discussed previously. The black line here is like the prediction according to the unifying theory for thermal convection, agreeing perfectly also with these Göttingen measurements, as well as the simulations that we are performing in this project. So these are older simulations, and like we see that these newer simulations are like even better agreeing with this theoretical prediction, as well as these latest measurements in Göttingen, having perfect agreement in the overall heat transfer properties in the system in experiments and simulations. So from this picture here, we can see that like the simulations require like a very high resolution in order to capture like all the flow details. So we see over here a zoom in on like the flow structures that are created of plumes rising up to the sidewall, and then we see that like the simulations are fully capturing all these flow details over here. What is particularly challenging is like the boundary layer dynamics we talked about previously. So this is like, if you're looking at the first pixel here on your screen, you would sort of see, if you would zoom in on that and like make a horizontal snapshot, you would see something like this. So you would get like very small plumes that are created very close to the plate, up which is like at a height of like only 0.04% of the domain height, but still these are like fully resolved, but like also very computationally intensive to sort of obtain that, requiring this very high resolution to do that. So like besides the global agreements in heat transfer, we also can like do some local flow measurement comparisons, which are shown in this figure over here, where we're looking at like locally measured temperature profiles in the experiments and the simulations, which can be characterized by this logarithmic dependence indicated over here. And then we see that there's like a perfect agreement between what's measured in the experiments and what is measured in the simulations, showing that there's like perfect agreement both for the global properties as well as the local properties, with the goal of like analyzing the simulations in much more detail than what is possible in the experiments. And like I would, for those of you like interested in more details on this, I would like to highlight this general article on the turbulence in ultimate convection, which is like published recently in the Physics Journal by Professor Detlef Loze. And with this, I would like to conclude that we are presenting here results from direct numerical simulations of turbulent convection at an unprecedented scale. And like what we show here is like the large-scale structure formation in very large turbulent convection, showing even larger turbulent flow structures when we make the flow more turbulent. So a very exciting result on that. And we're now looking at one-to-one comparisons between experiments performed in Göttingen, as well as like extremely novel direct numerical simulations showing perfect agreement between global as well as local flow quantities up to Rayleigh numbers of 10 to the 13. So at this I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would like to acknowledge financial support listed over here, as well as of course like the computational resources provided by LRZ and the Gauss Computing Center. Thank you very much.